Dr. Liesveld is a professor of medicine in the Division of Hematology and Oncology and clinical director of the Blood and Marrow Transplantation Program at the University of Rochester. Dr. Liesveld's research is focused on all types of leukemia, myeloproliferative disorders, myelodysplastic syndromes, multiple myeloma, and stem cell transplantation. She is the lead researcher on a current clinical trial studying crenolinib versus midostaurin following induction or consolidation therapy in newly diagnosed FLT3 positive AML patients. Dr. Liesveld recently joined us for an episode of our podcast in June on the FLT3 mutation and FLT3 inhibitors being used and tested in treatment. Thank you, Dr. Liesveld, for partnering with us again today.
Thank you, Kareth, and I'll try to share my screen here.
Okay, now you should be good.
Okay, great. Is everyone able to see the screens?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks for that introduction and thanks for the invitation to speak today. My talk will be a little bit more general about clinical trial participation with a focus on participation in the setting of relapsed and refractory acute myelogenous leukemia. And as Dr. Prespolevsky discussed, one of the good sources for understanding what trials are available in this space would be to go to the clinicaltrials.gov website. And the problem there is that when you just type in relapsed refractory AML, you do come up with 258 studies that are currently accruing or about to start accrual for relapsed refractory AML. And this can be a bit overwhelming. So it is possible to do more refined searching, and as was demonstrated at the beginning of this program, some of the other websites, such as the one that's been prepared by HealthTree, really do help you to hone down on these multiple trials to see what might be appropriate to your clinical setting. I think it's very important in a relapsed refractory setting to consider clinical trials, because not only in an intensive treatment setting where relapse occurs, but also in our older population where the standard treatment now tends to be a hypomethylating agent such as 5-azacitidine and decitabine along with venetoclax. Once patients don't respond to those treatments or respond and then stop responding or go into remission and then progress, the overall survival after that type of treatment is very dismal, particularly for those patients who are not able to access further treatment. But for patients that are able to go on to further treatment, that survival can be prolonged. But again, it's far from perfect. And that's where the great need for clinical trials in this space becomes very apparent. So I think whenever a patient is in a situation of a relapsed or refractory disease, it's very important to consider clinical trials that might be available. Now, in relapsed refractory AML, just as in upfront treatment, one can access all phases of clinical trials. And it's important when you enroll in a clinical trial that you understand what phase of trial this is, because this is going to have different expectations for you as a patient or a family member. Phase 1 trials are primarily geared to asking, is a given compound safe? For example, if a new FLT3 inhibitor were being developed, it would be tested probably in a phase 1 AML population in a relapsed refractory setting to find the right dose and to look at safety. A phase 2 trial then takes those compounds that appear to be safe and asks in a general way, usually in a fairly small number of patients, does this seem to work? Is there a positive signal that will then make it worthwhile to go on to what's called a phase 3 trial, where the question there is, does this work better than what's already out there as the standard of care? So many phase 3 trials are done in a randomized way so that half of the patients enrolled will receive standard of care and the other half will receive the standard of care regimen plus whatever investigational agent is being examined in a relapsed refractory setting. And then there are also some phase 4 trials that are available. These are not so much geared toward asking efficacy questions, but are looking to get additional safety data, perhaps expanding use of an already approved agent in a little bit different population. So some of those trials are also available in a relapsed refractory setting. In addition to the treatment trials that we just discussed, which are available at all phases and points of disease, you can also participate in some non-treatment trials. And these are also important of themselves because particularly in a relapsed refractory setting where people have already been through other treatments, often there are residual symptoms that are going to occur even during standard of care types of treatment. So enrolling on trials that might be looking at ways to improve symptoms or quality of life are also very important. And there are also some observational studies that are open to patients with relapsed refractory disease. These may be ones that are looking at a population outcomes data where it might be used to generate new hypotheses about how patients could be managed or monitored in the setting of measurable residual disease, which you heard about previously. And these are not necessarily going to be helpful to individual patients, but they're going to help the AML population as a whole. Now, when you decide whether to participate in clinical trials, I would have to say that trial participation does require a lot of motivation, usually on both the part of the patient and on the part of their caregiver network. It takes extra effort to be part of a clinical trial. And there can be potential benefits, so certainly looking at those is important. Many patients are aware that while they themselves may not benefit from a given trial, their participation is going to benefit the population as a whole and is going to help those of us who are doing research in the field understand how we can make outcomes better for all of our patients. And the other aspect of this is that many of my patients who are thinking about clinical trials feel a little bit vulnerable as they talk about this. Sometimes will be participating in a trial with an agent that hasn't really been tested in that many patients yet. And so you really have to discuss the trial completely with your providers and understand what those risks and benefits are, and have trust in the provider who's offering you that trial that may have potential benefit for you. So when you think about a clinical trial, there are a lot of important questions to ask. How long will the trial last? Will this be, a one and done type thing, or will you be on this trial for as long as your disease is responding? What is the goal of the trial, and what are your goals in participation? Are you trying to get to a second remission? Do you want to get onto a stem cell transplant, and is that allowed on the particular clinical trial? Or is the trial more designed just to potentially prolong survival without necessarily looking at transplant or other options afterward? What are the anticipated side effects or toxicities that you might expect? And what is already known about outcomes with previous use of the treatment that's in question? Another important question is, where will I have to go to participate in the trial? There may be a trial that's appropriate to your particular situation that isn't available at the center where you're being treated, or as we saw on that map that Kareth showed at the beginning, if you live in South Dakota, you may not have an AML center right near you, and so you're going to have to travel to participate in a trial. And how's that going to work out, and how can the center work with your local hematologist, oncologist to allow that participation? Always look at treatment alternatives, and it's also important to understand who's sponsoring the trial and whether there might be any financial implications for you. Most trials cover all the aspects of the trial that are investigational and that wouldn't be covered by insurance for standard of care type options, but it is important to just think about some of those additional trips, additional costs, because some of the barriers that patients mention in terms of clinical trial participation would be more testing is often involved. There may be more marrows, more other types of testing, more visits to your center. For some patients, it may be too far to go to get to the trial that they want to participate in. And then, as we talked about before, there are always, those unknown side effects and concerns about safety that it's important to discuss with your provider. Some trials are designed to reach FDA approval for the agent that is being developed, but others are not. So there are a lot of goals of the investigational trials that are also important to think about. Some other barriers, not once somebody is on a clinical trial, some patients have fears about not receiving the investigational treatment, and sometimes there's some confusion about what the term placebo-controlled trial means. And in general, for anyone who has AML or who certainly who has relapsed refractory AML, it really wouldn't be ethical to ever offer a trial that has a no treatment arm. So here, placebo-controlled usually means that one is offered standard of care either with or without what is being offered as the investigational agent, or the investigational agent is simply being compared to what would normally be the standard of care. So everyone would be receiving treatment that would have potential activity in that particular disease setting. And then there's also the understandable fears that go with thinking about, could there be additional harm from an experimental agent? And there always will be some inherent risk in participation in a clinical trial, but the trials are generally designed to minimize this risk, to make sure that all patients on trials are being monitored very intensively for any toxicities that are emerging. And all these agents will have undergone preclinical testing. There will be continuous safety evaluation, and most of the agents will have undergone phase 1 trials where a safe dose will have been established. And it's always important to know when you participate in a clinical trial that you can, as a subject, always withdraw for any reason at any time, and you don't even have to have a logical reason. It can just be based on your own personal desires. And as Dr. Wang showed us at the beginning, right now in AML, we are faced with lots of tools to use, but also lots of subtypes of the disease that we have to cover in terms of chromosomal and mutation status, different risk categories that our patients fall into. And that's why nationally there will be some clinical trials that hopefully can serve as an umbrella for all patients who are diagnosed with AML. And this is one that's under development by the NCI National Clinical Trials Network called MyeloMatch. While this won't be focused necessarily on the relapsed refractory setting, for patients who are diagnosed with AML in the future and who will be able to participate in this, both the younger patient basket as well as the older patient basket will have tiers in this trial that will be looking at early MRD detection and intervention for that, and also trials for relapse or progression that will utilize some of the targeted agents that you heard about in the previous 2 talks. And then also in our older AML patients, where many patients will be relapsing after they've had treatment with venetoclax and a hypomethylating agent, it's going to be important in a large population base to be able to look at some of the targeted agents for relapse, as well as other treatment interventions that may be able to have a positive benefit. And because of all those multiple subtypes of AML that are available, none of us at our own centers are going to have enough patients to answer those questions. So we really have to participate also in national trials. One previous trial that was actually for upfront patients that gives us hope that these kinds of large national trials might have benefit for our patients was the Beat AML Master Trial. This was open at 16 large AML centers throughout the country. They were able to come up with a molecular profiling on all the patients within a 7-day period. This was for older patients. And what was found in this trial was that there was better survival for those who went on their accepted assignment than those who didn't. And it showed that precision medicine can be used to inform how we place patients on clinical trials. And while we don't have similar data for relapsed refractory disease, this just shows that for patients who were able to go on to what they were assigned on this master protocol, they had better outcomes than when they chose a trial that their own physicians had available locally, or better than if they just access standard of care, and certainly better than those who had no other options but to go on supportive care or hospice. So it just shows us that nationally we can accomplish these kinds of clinical trials. Now, when you participate in a clinical trial, it's also important to know that the agent that's being examined, particularly if it's an early phase clinical trial, may never make it through to FDA approval. And that doesn't mean that the trial wasn't important. It just because we have to start somewhere to ask what's going to be efficacious in this disease. It's really only about 7% chance that a drug is going to pass all these phases of trials that we talked about and get FDA approval. But if it is a targeted therapy that's being examined, the chance of that approval is much higher. One of the problems we have in AML is that we historically have had a lack of randomized studies that compare to treatments that are of similar intensity. I think this is being been improved since this article was published that was came out in 2020, but really included only trials in 2016. But as you can see, we really lack a lot of trials that are comparing intensive versus non-intensive therapies. And that's also true in a relapsed refractory setting. One other question that comes up in terms of clinical trial participation, particularly during the COVID pandemic, is how is my trial participation going to affect my ability to receive COVID vaccines and COVID boosters? And the bottom line is that most experts agree that there shouldn't be any contraindications to COVID vaccination while on trials, and this should not affect trial eligibility based on either safety or tolerability of the vaccines. So there are many articles and recommendations that have come out from various societies about this, but COVID-19 concerns should not necessarily impact one's ability to access various AML trials. And this is a cartoon that I found a long time ago, and I know that those of you who are listening today are probably not of this mindset, but this gentleman says, I just heard there's a drug in trials that might stop my cancer. And she responds, great, are you going to volunteer to participate for the trial? Of course not, why would I do that? I wouldn't either, sure hope they get some results soon. And it is so important, particularly I think for our patients with relapsed refractory AML, where often our standard of care regimens that we have available are not going to have lasting benefit, to really have a positive attitude about clinical trials, despite sometimes all those barriers and extra testing and extra visits that those are going to require, because it's only through that participation that we're going to make things better, not only for our current patients, but for our patients that come in the future. And I'll stop there and we'll take questions at the end. So thanks for your attention.